speaking of our broad agenda, we'll move next to our guests who are with us today. What I will do is introduce them all three, and then so we can move through quickly for each. But I think I'll spend just a second to, obviously, it really goes without saying that with COVID-19 and the pandemic, the work of the Workforce Development Board has become ever more pivotal and critical to moving our workforce forward, even in these unprecedented times. I'll also spend just a second to say thank you to the staff of the Workforce Development Board, who really have worked, I think, just very hard. I know they work hard before this, but I think that the work and the concentration on really moving a lot of our agenda forward has not ceased in light of just a different way in which we work. So I think that the presentations that you will hear now will really help us to give us greater insight, which I thought would be a good thing to do at this juncture during our first meeting during the pandemic, to give some focus on some of the things that we've been talking about, most notably the future of work, which Brian mentioned during his report. So this, the study is even more relevant, of course, during this time. And the changes in the workplace that we are expecting. For instance, we've talked about a few of these things: technology tools, automation, artificial intelligence, even. All of that is presumed to come faster during this time. So Dr. Josh Howley is from the Ohio State University. He's the lead researcher on the study, and he brings a research focus in the workforce development space. So I'd like to welcome you, Dr. Howley. Next will be Ned Hill, who's a professor of economic development at the John Glenn College of Public Affairs, where he's a part of OSU's discovery theme in sustainable and resilient economies. His latest co-authored book is Coping with Adversity: Regional Economic Resilience and Public Policy, and was published by Cornell University Press in 2017. And we've invited Dr. Hill to give us his outlook on the Central Ohio economy going forward from this crisis. And finally, last but not least, is my friend, actually, Jung. It's great to have you with us today. He is the Managing Director for Research and Intelligence from One Columbus. He's been monitoring key indicators in Central Ohio during this crisis, and we've asked him to share what One Columbus is seeing in Central Ohio. And Jung and I were on a board together, so it's great to have you with us today. So with that, I will for the board to welcome our guests, and we will start with you, Dr. Howley. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Chair, for the invitation to address the board. I just want to make sure you can hear me. I turned on the mic. Yeah, okay.
We hear you fine.
And just to apologize in advance, my internet seems to be going in and out this morning. So if you lose me, I will come back on. So this is phase 2 report for the future of smart work, and but for a lot of other things, I think we would have been together far sooner. But I'm actually, as an academic, I just have to say crises are very clarifying. And, we have the luxury in some ways of kind of stepping back. So while I'm not going to play Karnak, on this presentation, I'll leave that to Ned. I think that, I'll try to intersperse in my substantive presentation on the results of the analyses we did, which were both kind of statistical and qualitative. I'll try to intersperse with that some reflections on how the kind of economic changes we're experiencing firsthand might have implications for Central Ohio and for the Workforce Board. So we all know, if you go to the next slide, please. Who's doing the slide control? Is that Cece?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Cece. So, and I think, yeah, go to the next one, please. So this kind of program of work that we received a grant from you all to carry out, and thank you for that. Included 3 phases. The first phase you had a presentation on. The second phase includes both a kind of focus on the human capital kind of evaluation, and Bill Lafayette and myself and a number of others contributed to that. And then a more difficult process kind of evaluation of kind of the capabilities of the system, and then some recommendations for kind of figuring out how to close gaps. There is a potential third phase that the board, I suppose, will in many ways will think about that is much more detail oriented. So we'll go to the next one, please. Just getting into a little bit more detail here. In phase 1 and 2, when we're focusing on industry and occupational structure and economic drivers, there's both an interest in industries and occupations, as well as a kind of a focus on how do you benchmark those to other kind of strategies that other regions are pursuing that have similar smart city kind of perspectives. So this is a little bit different than some workforce development reports, because we're with the smart cities angle. There's a kind of a limiting to kind of best practices that might be more common with big international cities, as well as kind of similar metropolitan areas in the United States, which I think gives you a fascinating opportunity as a region to kind of identify some practices that may be common in a place like Seoul as opposed to a place like Pittsburgh. So you may normally look to, say, Pittsburgh or Cleveland or for comparables, but in this crisis environment, you may be also drawn to places like Seoul or Bangkok or Singapore, that may be doing a really good job dealing with the technological requirements for the new economy in the COVID crisis. So I think you have that as an opportunity. So please go to the next one. Some of the smart city kind of best practices we've thought of, the workforce development component of the smart cities is not a known set of best practices. There's both the education and training aspects of it, the talent development, which might be more the HR kind of side of things. And then there's a lot of kind of relationship between smart cities and equity that might be called kind of inclusion or kind of bottom-up approaches. And you'll see later on in the report that we spent a lot of time thinking through what are the reactions that the communities are facing to the introduction of massive kind of technological changes brought upon by smart cities. So please, next. The next slide is just kind of a representation, and this is where I was saying kind of the international dimension comes in here. As a point of fact, the consideration of kind of how the smart cities have implications for education and training is something that's relatively common. What are the smart cities implications for, say, the HR systems in companies or talent development programs? That's actually relatively uncommon in smart cities kind of policies. So, while New York may be dealing with this in a very practical way, a lot of cities are not. In contrast, I would say that there's virtually every smart city has a technological kind of component, which is the core part of it. And this is often captured in kind of this living labs kind of component. Please, next slide. And this is just some representations, and you've seen some of these slides before. I'm just kind of reviewing them before I get to the main event. Please, the next one. So the industry and occupational analysis that Bill led, he did, and this is where the caveats start, because a lot of what the trends that we project forward depend on Department of Labor statistical data that kind of, when you do projections forward, you're kind of projecting based on current economic conditions or projected future economic conditions. And I think we all kind of understand in general that there's going to be slow kind of labor market growth going forward. We also all, I think, understand that as you go further out in projection world, disruptions are going to be more potentially widespread. And so what the COVID crisis has done is just kind of push those disruptions more into the present, I think, and made the recession kind of a foregone conclusion. And so the issue is less, do the projections still hold? They're never an exact science. The question is, what are the implications? And the implications that Bill may have thought were kind of a 20% likelihood 5 years from now are probably, the worst case unemployment situation times 10 right now. So some of the implications are just going to be more dramatic now than they were, rather than fundamentally wrong. Go to the next one, please. This is just a representation of how that comes back to haunt us very, very quickly. This federal statistical data lags a lot of things, but in terms of just employment, this is an example of some of the stuff I'm sure Ned will go into, and I hope I don't steal the graph he's trying to present. But in April, this is total employment in the U.S. and total employment in Columbus. And it isn't that Columbus is doing any better. The red line is the U.S. It's just that the statistical data at the regional level lags the statistical data at the national level. So employment just fell off a cliff. That's what falling off a cliff looks like in a statistical sense. And it's just, our county-wide employment, our region-wide employment followed that. And it's true pretty much for the entire country. So some of the trends that we're going to see are going to be impacted, fundamentally changed because of this, but others are just going to be magnified or go ahead, please. Next slide. So this is, nothing's going to change the supply fundamentally of labor. And it is interesting to note just the flattening of population growth in the Midwest, in the US as a whole. Different age groups, you're still seeing an increase over time in the older age cohorts. Most of us on the call probably are age cohorts. And then, you're seeing a flattening kind of labor supply, and that's not going to fundamentally change. So as always with education and training policy, what's going to matter in the Midwest is primarily what you do with people who are either in the labor market currently or people who are not utilized as effectively in the labor market. And those are just things that are going to be more magnified given the economic conditions you saw in the prior graph where we're falling off a cliff in terms of employment. Unless you see a mass migration of people, like a Dust Bowl type migration, our kind of working age population is just kind of going to static out. And that will have implications for firms, but it also will have implications for education and training providers in terms of who they're trying to recruit. So they should be focusing on, the older adult rather than on the high school age student, for example. Please, the next one. So when we did a lot of analysis of the industry and occupation drivers, and the kind of a driver just means that, and you've heard Bill talk about this, I'm sure 100 times at different events, but a driver just in essence means it's the concentration of employment is above what you would expect in the region. So these are just four, just to show you how varied the results will be and are in the report. And they're four that potentially matter to the Smart Columbus universe, kind of warehousing and storage, research and development under science, general medical and surgical hospitals, and then credit intermediation. And you'll see that the employment rates, the number of people employed vary quite substantially based on the economic drivers. So there are not a lot of people employed in scientific research and development services, but it's still a very important driver for the region. In contrast, hospitals are immensely a large number of employees. And I do think we often overlook when we do trend analyses that those industries that are really important to us are often quite small as a percentage of total employment. And we often under-focus on those industries that have a large amount of jobs and don't pay attention as much to the training needs, for example, of food service workers or accommodation workers, both of which experienced enormous layoffs in the last, couple of months. And they're not particularly coming up in the Smart Columbus kind of environment. Trend just means kind of what's the trend in terms of employment that Bill is projecting, prior to COVID. And you'll notice that for a lot of economic drivers, the trend for employment is expected to be static. The one exception here on this short list I brought to you is credit intermediation. Projected growth, these are just referring to what he's kind of projecting in terms of the employment growth. And you'll notice just a lot of variability. The one that has potentially larger increases are scientific research and development, but it's a small N kind of industry cluster. And then the issues are my own attempt to just kind of put my Karnak hat on. And I think that, a lot of the potential what's going to happen in the economy in the future for employment and for training depends on kind of demand and the funding. So scientific research and development, OSU, for example, or, nationwide children's, public funding is the big thing. And if public funding dries up, then the employment in those kinds of places are going to decline. In contrast, medical and surgical hospitals are demand driven, which means that if people stop going to get elective surgery, then what we've seen, happens. A lot of support workers in hospitals, outpatient hospitals, are getting laid off. So the kind of implications will change. Technology has a very dramatic effect on all of these areas of work, but I think the one that seemed the most critical here is just credit services. With fewer and fewer kind of potential workers, there'll be kind of a more rapid modernization of technology on the credit and banking side that I think will be brought on by the COVID area. So some of this is kind of hard baked into the report, and Bill has done his projections, and some of my comments are here of my own making. We go to the next slide. This is just a representation of what I was talking about. You can see some of the driver industries. And Bill also does projections for what are called stable industries, challenged industries, and then emerging industries. Urban transit systems, for example, is kind of what the heart of smart cities work in Columbus is. Those are projected to increase substantially in all phases of his models. So it's an emerging industry, but it's a very small N employment. So, 1,200 people in the region, as opposed to, 16,000 for freight trucking or something. So you just have to be careful at what you focus on here. If you focus on projected growth, you may identify something that, you're going to get a lot of kind of attention out of in the market, but you're not going to get a lot of training spots or jobs opening for those areas. Please, the next one. This is again kind of baseline projections with a kind of focus on the probability of computerization of these jobs. And again, this is prior to COVID. I think, if anything, these estimates on the probability of computerization are changed. So, you know, you'll see that we kind of attach a percentage probability to each kind of industry occupation, and then kind of a percent of total employment. So an industry like heavy tractor trailer truck drivers might have a 0.79 probability of computerization in the model, and then but it's 14% of the total employment, whereas something like software developers might be only a 0.13 kind of probability, but it's only 2.5% of employment. So be careful again what you focus on. Focus on the ones that are high percentages of employment. That's my my recommendation, and worry about those. It matters more if all of the truck drivers are if their jobs are automated, because it will affect dramatically more people. That's just the point. Again, these are all guesstimates. You know, we don't know what is going to happen in this world. So next slide, please. This is one of the economists I follow put together something called the Remote Labor Index, and this is a nice heuristic for showing kind of for approximately the 30% of the jobs in the economy that can be done, you know, at a distance. It's kind of showing how that relates to other employment in a gross level. So if you look at construction and extraction, that's obviously almost 0% of those jobs can be done remotely. In contrast, education, training, and libraries, many of those jobs can be done remotely. And then the band is the distribution of the jobs within that kind of larger occupational category. So, you know, a wide band means that there's a wide variation. A narrow band, for example, on farming, fishing, and forestry means that very few of those jobs ever will be done at a distance. And this analysis it's something I didn't do, but I'm very confident in it. It's an analysis based on ONET occupational classifications, which some of you may have heard of. And even if you haven't, it's basically, it's something that we could operationalize in Central Ohio very easily to look at how the remote, what's remote in terms of the labor system. So go ahead. So the last piece of the work we did, so we did kind of an analysis of the stakeholder engagement, and this was a kind of there were basically two components to this. There was an attempt to do a kind of listening sessions and then focus groups, and many of you participated in this. And this is just a listing kind of the groups. We did a group of visionaries, some sector groups like transportation, electrification, and then some groups that did workforce providers and community. And then we also did some listening sessions at different places last summer and fall. Please go down. The results are hard to summarize in a quick sense, and I would encourage you to read this section of the report particularly because it's nicely detailed. The results are kind of in 5 buckets, and a lot of people reflected on the identity in Central Ohio and the uniqueness of the of the community, and that as a kind of a really important set of attributes. New career pathways. Many people kind of talked about where the community can be most kind of efficient in providing people new skills. So is it classroom training or at a distance? And some of those comments are actually somewhat predictive of events that have come around in the post-COVID world. How do you build a resilient workforce is still an important kind of thing that came out in the additional results. And then two kind of areas of reflection that from the interviews and the focus groups are we leaving some people behind, and what are the attempts that the Smart Columbus kind of smart vision, you know, are doing to reach underserved communities? And those are two somewhat more important. I mean, they were important prior to COVID. They're absolutely critical right now with the skyrocketing number of people receiving food and unemployment benefits. We're leaving more and more people behind. It's just a lot larger percentage of the labor force right now. And so I would reckon that, you know, as a group, you're probably wrestling with how do you address both, you know, the training needs and also how do you intersect with larger kind of human services needs in the community. And I think that's a really important set of conversations. So the meat of the report, kind of I've kind of gone over at a very high level. And if you go to the next slide, some policy recommendations that are at a very high level. And we tried out a couple of versions of the policy recommendations, and this is kind of what we ended up on. You know, and some of these, again, I don't think will fundamentally change given COVID. You know, they're kind of separated into two areas: the education system and the workforce system. Short-term credentials are important, both because you're dealing with a population that's aging, and you're not dealing with typically with people coming straight out of high school, although those are still a critical component of the new labor force. And now you're going to be dealing with a lot of people coming back to work from unemployment, back to work from periods of underemployment, and so short-term credentials will be even more important. Competency-based training seems like a real intersection with the smart cities and trend, and again, I think will be something that is accelerated through the COVID. There seems to be, and I see that PG's on here, and I saw Steve was on here too. They will both kind of understand a lot of this more than I will, but looking at kind of how you build youth exposure to careers is, I still think, the holy grail in many ways of how we respond to economic crises. Figuring out, and actually Jim's on here and we've intersected on this in the past too. I mean, you know, how you build the case for youth to enter a career as opposed to think about high school or a 2-year college degree as a, either a pit stop on the way to adulthood, or, I'm not sure what. I mean, I have to say, personally, I have 2 kids who are in college, and the 1 year my daughter spent doing a work-based learning program in high school was the most critical time for her. High school was kind of a miss, but that work-based learning was absolutely important. So I just say, having had personal experience with this, as well as being a professor who studies this, I'm more and more convinced that we do need to expose kids to careers, and that's the only way to fix the attachment issue to the labor market. And I'm sure I'll get some questions. On the workforce development side, the systems side of workforce development still needs some work. We know this, it needs to be kind of expanding partnerships with K through 12 and on relationships with firms, two sides of the kind of labor force in some ways, and looking at how we use data, and then looking at how we project forward what the workforce development system is going to be in the future. I fear I've taken too much time, but this report has been gestation for so long that I feel some license. Please, the next one. And then, at the last minute, I kind of was asked to give you some sense of some supportive policy changes. And I think there is a lot of argument to be made that broadband and internet service is kind of like water these days. It's something that you have to have at a very low cost for everybody. And we've all seen terrible pictures of kids sitting in parking lots, trying to get some Wi-Fi to do their homework. And I think we've, all seen on Facebook, I have many times, reflections on people trying to apply for unemployment claims, from an old phone, when they don't have, Wi-Fi, and they don't have phone service. So they're just trying to, sit in a library parking lot. So I think that it really brings to the forefront the need for thinking about basic infrastructure in consumer technology as a basic good. I mean, it's not my policy area, but I think it's important. Job search, I think we've seen a lot of move towards job searching online. I'm gratified to hear from Brian that you're doing work online already. I think that's going to be more and more important, and the infrastructure to do that will depend on a lot of the smart city kind of inventions like AI and kind of predictive modeling and machine learning, all acronyms, but they're very important acronyms in this case. Training, we have no idea kind of how we're going to build the training infrastructure, I think, to respond to the dramatic increase in the number of people needing training in this. And I think the only, historical precursors we have are the preparation for war and coming out of the Great Depression. And those are the scale of the response that any community will need to respond to the current crisis. Labor market data, labor market data is super important. It lags everything. The infrastructure to do it has been chopped by the federal government and many times. And if there's ever a time to invest kind of in a lot of kind of infrastructure on labor market data, it's now. So I think I've way over my time. I apologize, but I'm happy to take questions if there's time.
Okay, we're checking the chat box and see if there's any questions.
While she's doing that, Josh, you didn't take too long. I mean, this is a really important to us. So I just want to verify. So what I hear you saying by this is where we make the most impact is by really focusing on, number one, those jobs that have high employment but are likely to decrease as a demographic, focus on those people. And then we should be looking at those areas where there is growth or long-time maintenance of those jobs and high employment in those areas if we really want to make a large impact. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, again, that is not a controversial statement, but it is true based on the data and is more true now than it was 8 weeks ago. But I would say simultaneously, unless you can figure out how to better integrate youth into careers at an early age, you're just replicating the problem. you know, 10 years from now. So unless we can figure out how to dramatically increase the number of, you know, 18 to 16 really to 22-year-olds getting career training early and getting career advising early, then we're just going to replicating the problem. We're going to have a lot of remediation that we're going to need. So you need both of those sides of things, and I think that's what I'm saying.
Don't see any questions popping through. So thank you, Dr. Howley. Thank you for that highlight of our report, which we deem very important. And I shall never forget that you said, you know, broadband and access to broadband is as critical as water. That's pretty powerful.
No problem. And I just have to give a shout out to Cece, Lisa, Mandy, and the Smart Columbus team. This was and Brian, this was a labor of love on everybody's part, and we all worked really hard to get it done. So thank you. Thank you for
there are a lot of thank yous in the chat, Josh. You should take a look.
Yes, it is.
I can't see the chat. I don't know why. Oh, there they are. Well, I know so many of you. It's kind of funny. I know so many of you. I didn't realize I'd know so many of you.
Well, they're all well done, Dr. Howley. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so
Yeah,
I'm going to go on mute.
Okay. All right, Dr. Hill, we'll hear from you now.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Well, my presentation isn't going to be a pure economic forecast. It's really going to be looking at what did we learn about recessions in the past and what are some policy lessons. But I'll make a couple comments to start with about the COVID-19 recession. The first thing is, as Josh pointed out, with the deterioration of investment in the federal statistical machinery, we're pretty much flying an airplane without any instruments right now. And the data themselves are going to be coming out fairly slowly. We've had I'm looking down at my notes. Tomorrow, the second estimates of GDP from the first quarter are going to be out. That will give us some clarity. At the national level, the state and regional statistics don't start showing up until about July. That affects us. So when we look at the numbers, I mean, it's pretty much, we know that the economy had a heart attack, and it was the new filings for unemployment really gave us the best information as to what was happening not only in the state but nationally. We aren't going to get a view of the second quarter of this year until July, again nationally, and that really is going to be when we get the first good picture of how extensive the attack on the economy was. Just to give you a notion as to why this is so uncertain, is that the economy was growing at a modest but steady rate for January, February, and then March 6th happened. And the shutdown of the economy started a little bit around March 6th, but then at March 14th, Ohio being in the lead, it just came crashing to a halt. So when you saw the GDP numbers showing that we lost 4.3% in growth rate of GDP, all of that occurred in 3 weeks in the numbers. So that's pretty frightening. So it's going to be the second quarter, which is data on April, May, and June. We'll be able to get a better view of what's happening again nationally. The question that I've been getting fairly frequently is, what's this recession going to look like? Is it going to look like the Great Depression, which is an L, sharp drop, go flat? There was hope that we would have a V, sharp drop, sharp recovery. I actually think that if we're going through the alphabet, I'll go for a W. The W meaning very sharp drop. We're starting to see some recovery starting this week, and you'll see gradual recovery in the economy through July, and then I expect between July and September that we're going to get another shock to the economy. That shock is going to be coming from layoffs from the public sector. It's when new budget years take place and the new budgets get put in place on July 1. Again, this is not just Ohio, this is across the country. you'll see accelerating layoffs in state and local government and real struggles in the K through 12 education system to fund their operations because of balanced budgets. If Congress doesn't step in, the shock will be pretty severe. Then the question is, all right, when is that right-hand side of the W? Is it going to be sharp? Is it going to be slow? It's going to be pretty slow. And the reason why I'm saying it's pretty slow is if we look at the Great Recession, it took two years and 10 months to get back to the level of GDP we had before the Great Recession started. And this is, we don't have the heart attack of the financial services sector we had in the Great Recession, but we've got very important weaknesses that are going to show up in the automobile industry, oil and gas, and in aircraft that's going to affect the nation. The other area where there could be weakness, and the Fed's working very hard to prevent this, is that an awful lot of corporate debt is essentially junk debt, particularly coming out of Europe, that's been collateralized the same way home mortgage debt was. If the corporate finance market starts going south, then it'll spread into financial intermediation fairly quickly. So there's very risk here. There is risk here. In terms of the Great Recession, how long did it get back to the number of jobs we had before we slid into the recession? That was 5 years and 1 month. So thinking that we're going to be quickly back by the end of 2020 is insane. The notion, I've been quoted before that I think that we're going to be well into 2013 before we're back to a road to recovery. The reason why I say this is because of my expected second shock, late summer, early fall. Also understanding that until the population hits a 60% vaccination rate against COVID-19, it's going to be very difficult to get people to reestablish their economic lives again. So I think that we are going to be in some challenges up through 2023. Next slide, please. So when we look to the responses to these shocks, we see differences in the response to gross product versus the response to employment. From every recession starting in the 1970s, we're seeing where gross product and employment used to come back almost in parallel. Since the 1970s, the gap between the recovery in gross product and employment has gotten longer in terms of months. So gross product comes back much more quickly than does employment. And what we saw, the behavior from employers, is that they get so shell-shocked and their infrastructure gets so eaten away during the recession, they're going to use overtime before they bring back new employment. Next slide, please. So this is it comes out of our book, Coping with Adversity, looking at shocks, every shock from 1978 to 2007, and at the metropolitan level, many metropolitan areas had multiple shocks. If you look up in this area right here, what you see is that the average time to recovery across all these shocks was 2.9 years. In employment, the average recovery in terms of gross product was 2.4 years. And that was from the start of the shock to getting back up to the same level of employment or GDP in the economy. Employment takes longer to recover. There's part of what I think we're going to see in this recovery, and this goes back to what Josh talked about and what your job is. You're going to find that coming as employment grows, companies are going to be recapitalizing and rethinking about the way they do business, and you're going to see increasing use of things like telecommuting and a lot more digitization of the work environment. In manufacturing, I expect to see a large decrease in the number of semi-skilled employees, while the value of what takes place and the growth and demand for engineering technologists is going to skyrocket. So this is just looking from 78 to 2007. Next slide, please. For those metropolitan areas that were in chronic distress, this is again from 78 to 07, what we found out is there's a very small number of metros, about 25% of them, experience chronic distress, but the frightening thing is, of that 25%, almost 90% of them did not recover their level of GDP, but they did recover, more of them recovered their employment levels. But what happened is the jobs that replaced the jobs that were destroyed were lower waged and lower benefit. This isn't relevant to the Columbus region, but it is relevant to the small to mid-sized metro areas throughout and across the state of Ohio. I've got very concerns about the Mansfields of this world and the metro areas along the Ohio River. Next slide, please. Looking at what did we learn from coping with adversity was, well, markets really worked. Of the 1,500 employment shocks we saw, 47% of metro areas were resistant to those shocks. Columbus did an amazing job from 78 to 07 of resisting all shocks except for the Great Recession. Of those that were shocked, 65% were resilient. They returned to their previous growth path. 35% weren't resilient. That's because their economic base was destroyed during the shock and they had difficulty recovering. Again, not so much a Columbus issue, but again, other parts of the Midwest, it's important, and the state prospers as one. Next slide, please. So what did we learn about the Great Recession? Well, the first thing was the Great Recession affected 92% of all metropolitan economies. What's different between the Great Recession and what's going to be known as the COVID-19 recession is the COVID-19 recession shocked 100% of all economies in the nation. So the Great Recession, only 8.3% of the economies were shock resistant. 79% were resilient, meaning they shocked and came back. I expect that we are going to see within a 2-year period after a 4-year period after the shock ended. Over a 4-year period, I think you're going to see most regional economies will indeed come back. Columbus, I expect to be in that bucket. But 30% of the economies coming out of this are probably not going to come back to their same growth rate. Interestingly enough, some of those economies actually may be the 5 big economies that have been driving growth in the United States coming out of the Great Recession. You may see slower rate of return out in Silicon Valley, out in Los Angeles and New York City. I don't think it's going to be so much fear of going back to the city. I think they, though, are going to be very susceptible to telecommuting. If broadband's in place, some of those workers are going to be moving outside of the metropolitan area. Other things that we saw was that the average number of years to recover to their pre-shock growth rate was 2.7 years versus 2.3 years. So that meant that there was almost half a year longer in recovery for the typical metropolitan area than from all previous recessions. I believe this again is going to be longer. The other reason why I think that there's going to be the COVID-19 recession is going to end up with a longer recovery period is I think Congress is going to have its shorts in such a knot they aren't going to be able to deal with some of the big issues that we have to face. The largest one is what are you going to do with writing down the explosion in the federal debt? There's going to be lots of demand for spending on things like infrastructure and education. But meanwhile, we are going to have a debt that's going to be about 110 to 120% of current GDP. I believe strongly we should be deficit spending aggressively, but we have destroyed the elasticity of the tax system and the sense of fairness in that tax system. So try to get a post-World War II consensus on how to get our macroeconomic house in order is going to be quite difficult. Next slide, please. When it comes to dealing with recessions at the regional level, understand there's no one silver bullet, and there's no one recipe that will work for every single metropolitan areas. And these were some things that we learned when we examined the history of shocks from 78 to 2007. Those places that are poorly educated were more likely to experience a downturn, and they were more likely to be resilient. That was strange, but we're finding a large number of metro areas, particularly out in the Southwest, which are low skilled, but also low labor cost. And so therefore they have been showing some resilience. And they are the places that benefit from onshoring or bringing activity back. The second finding we saw was those places that were more dependent on manufacturing were more likely to experience a downturn, but they were more likely to be resilient. They were quicker to bring their people back. And the reason for that is that they had the capital investment in place. Those certain economies that were service sectors, service oriented, it took them longer to come back. And I think that's going to happen with this recession. I believe the travel, tourism, convention industry is going to be very slow to return as people have to rebuild their own financial houses and as fear of travel takes place, and also as meeting and convention planners try to restart their industry again. I think that's going to take a while. Shockingly enough, those places that had income inequality had a smaller chance of a recession of gross metropolitan product, and they were more likely to be resilient. Those places that were more equal had much more difficulty. Why? Well, what turns out is those places that were much more equal tended to have lower growth rates, and they also, what you see is that inequality is a sign that you've got one portion of your economy is declining, and that's where you've got the bulk of your workforce. Meanwhile, a smaller fraction of your workforce is growing with new industries and new employment opportunities, and those labor shortages drive up wages. Believe it or not, income inequality is actually a sign of economic progress. I had a conversation with Governor Kasich where I began to think I was in the front row of SeaWorld's water park from the amount of water that was coming from the governor spitting in my direction as he started to talk. He was expressive, still is. But why did he get so upset? Well, I pointed out to him that Ohio actually had a greater level of income equality than most other states. And he looked at me and said, well, why? I said, well, because we have a smaller fraction of our population that is Great Gatsby-like, extraordinarily rich. And he said, we got to lower taxes because all those rich people are leaving Ohio and they're going to Florida, otherwise known as heat-seeking money bag geezers. And I had to dissuade him of that idea. I said, no, that actually isn't true. We don't have them because we aren't growing new industries, and we don't have large capital gains from people who are getting the windfalls from disruptive economies, that we don't have rich heat-seeking geezers flying off to tax havens in Florida because we don't have that many rich people to start with. And that really is, that really reflected the historical death of entrepreneurship in Ohio from 1960s up until actually the Strickland administration, building on the Taft administration, started reinventing entrepreneurship in the state. So one of the things that's going on is I believe that we should be focusing economic fairness much more than income inequality, because actually we need people starting new businesses and making boatloads of money as a way of building jobs. This will not get me elected anywhere, but thank God I don't have to run for any office. We also see that export diversity protects against employment shocks. Having a broadly diverse economic base is a great thing. And the diversity, again, of mid-Ohio is really something to be good at. So that's the reason why I put so much effort on manufacturing while services are growing, because that's part of our diversity. And I have to go and look and see what that last line is because I got a bulletin over it. Oh, yeah, this is another one that people don't like. Right-to-work states were positively, metros and right-to-work states were much more resilient to employment and GMP shocks, and metros in right-to-work states had higher growth rates on the order of 20 to 40 basis points a year. Reason for that seems to be it isn't so much union avoidance is a big deal. It really, we think, is capital risk is the issue behind it. One of my co-authors wanted to kill me over this finding, but the data are the data. Right-to-work states just grow slower. Capital avoids them. And so we have to, again, talk about fairness in the way it affects economic growth. Next slide, please. So there are different regional paths to development. So this is important for, I think, for public policy in Ohio. It is not the role of the states to behave in a countercyclical way. We can't do it. We don't have enough money. We don't have the ability to run deficits. Most importantly, we do not have our own currency. We do not have Ohio dollars that can devalue. So that means that the public policy issue for us is maintaining the long-term vision of where you want to go and keep on investing around that long-term vision. So I was delighted to hear the report that Josh delivered really was one of kind of maintaining investment in our future and our investment in future workforce, particularly kids. Because the fact is, it's who's ready to prosper at the back end of the recession wins. So rebound implies cyclical forces at work, but what we also find is the economic base changes in almost every single recession, particularly if a place is disproportionately affected. What's disproportionately affected in Columbus actually has been that part of the two parts of the economy that have provided opportunity for low-skilled workers. That's the convention, hotel, tourism business, and the logistics industry. Those are probably going to be affected coming out of this recession. So part of what I think we have to do is saying, what are new avenues for opportunity for low and semi-skilled workers that found a way of making a living and found opportunity in those industries that are hurt. The other point is that this new equilibrium applies adaptive capacity, the ability to reconfigure. So how flexible are we? And that's the important part about promoting entrepreneurship. Next slide, please. So what states and localities have to recognize their limits. This isn't in the book. This is actually advice we've been giving to a few governors that have called in as they've been dealing with the shock. The single most important thing for states to do is optimize the use of federal stimulus funds. That's where the redistribution takes place. In fact, your operation is a huge funnel for federal funds. So how can we use them wisely and smarter than other regions? The second rule that we came up with, principle, is spend when money can influence sustainable outcomes. There was a rush in Ohio for some counties, some cities, in some ways the states, to try to provide a softer landing from businesses when we didn't have enough money to make for a sustainable difference. And that's when you really have to put on the green eye shade or act like an economist, say, that's a game we can't play with. We're going to advocate with Washington to make those differences, but we don't have enough cash to do it. Third rule is do no harm when there's no gain. This was important for trying to get the state to relax rules when people are late paying property taxes, income taxes, wage taxes. We don't necessarily want to shut down a business and delay its comeback if the state is going to get a windfall. At the same time, we don't want to encourage tax evasion. And recognize, and this is really important, this is where that second hit that can come from COVID-19, recognize that actions of government will have large employment implications to the private sector because of the amount of contracting we do. So if school systems cut back, understand that not only is going to be the teachers, but there's a supply chain around it that's going to be hurt. Thinking about road construction and other activities. So this is important, not for the fact the state of Ohio can't run a deficit, and you don't want to raise taxes during a recession, even though I think our tax structure really inhibits our long-term growth, but that's a different policy discussion. This is getting Washington to understand that they can give us a secondary heart attack if we end up chopping state and local government overly aggressively. Next slide, please. So what then are the cyclical policies that really make a difference? The first thing is government, do no harm. 3, maintain the basics. The basics are public health, public safety, infrastructure. As well, I would argue that employment and training really works. What we see is that one of the large drivers of recovery is an educated, flexible workforce. Avoid stagnation and decline. If you stop being forward-looking, you stop investing in your future, that means that's when you start reversing your growth trend. You start going down. You start declining, and that makes it much harder to pull back up in. And then the thing is prepare for aftershocks. don't think and wish that this is just a one-time event and it's going to be all cleared up in the middle of the summer. It's not. And we have to be prepared for continuing shocks to the employment system, continuing shocks to the safety net, which is very, very weak, and a continuing set of shocks two particular times when I think we're vulnerable to shocks. The first is a public sector shock for layoffs June through September, and then November through January, a secondary round of COVID-19 mixed with the flu. I think that that's quite reasonable. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm such a happy guy. So coming out of our work in coping with adversity, what really seems to work? And those policies that are structural but not cyclical are what's really important at the state and local or metropolitan level. I keep on going back to this. It's not in the slide deck, but I think it's really important. Economies are region-wide, they aren't city-wide. The economy is where people both live and work. One of Columbus's competitive advantage is the fact that as a region, we work better than most other regions. And it's important that we stay that way. So what are the four big structural non-cyclical things to do is talent development from pre-K to technical and higher education. If we let our foot up on the gas, it's going to be tougher for the region. Now we know that the K through 12 budget is going to be dropping, but we have to be educating. We have to be continuing to advocate to continue to talent development. I agree so much with Josh on this one point, that experiential education, particularly for kids who come from disadvantaged households or kids that have fallen behind in their education. And remember, we're going to have a very long summer vacation, so it's going to hurt them. That experiential education is vital to their development. We have a workforce crisis starting at age 16. I think most of the people on this call started working for somebody when they're 16 years old. If we have kids in rural neighborhoods or inner city neighborhoods, they are not within walking distance or bicycling distance from work. So therefore they are losing that experience. And that notion of kid is now going up from 14 to 17, 18 years old, now going up to the early 20s. Second thing that we saw really makes a difference is workforce development that's sector-led and skill-focused is really important. It's not as important as pre-K, technical, and higher education, but making certain that sector-led, demand-responsive, skill-focused, objectively measured workforce development is really important. And I think coming out of this recession is going to be more so. Why? Because skills certificates that are objectively measured lower search costs. Do you know that it is cheaper to search and hire a nurse than it is to hire a factory worker? That's because with a nurse, you understand what those credentials mean. With a factory worker, you just basically say, can you show up and can you pass a drug test? Of modest help we found, but consistent help is well executed firm level technical assistance and entrepreneurship programs make a difference. Things like SBDC, the Small Business Development Centers, the Manufacturing Extension Partnership Program, those types of activities make a difference because it isn't so much taking companies that they are going to take companies to a higher growth rate. The data show they have higher survival rates. And we also have to continue to invest in amenities as a corollary to building and attracting local talent. In the middle of paying attention to the social service crisis that COVID-19 recession is going to trigger, that is a full agenda. But as a regional agenda, it's an agenda that will get us and the state to out in a more competitive position at the end. Oh, thank you for your patience. Oh, you can do the next slide, and you'll see me say thank you in writing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hill.
Oh, you're welcome.
Lisa, you were going to add?
Yeah, I was just going to ask Ned. So as the workforce board, then I'm wondering, it seems to me that we're usually a little too heavy on the job seeker side and not as heavy as we should probably be on helping business maintain and develop new job opportunities. Otherwise, we're not going to have jobs to put people we train in. And I'm just, is that a fair statement based on what I hear you say?
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I think most people who are looking at countercyclical activities, most economists, I don't want to say people, we aren't necessarily people, have been looking at the model in Europe, particularly in Germany, as being a good way of dealing with cyclical shocks. I mean, it's much better to keep a person in a job than lay them off and bring them back, because you avoid screening costs, you keep the workplace culture as well as the discipline of going to work. The second point is that experiential education is important, and one thing that you could do is if you essentially subsidize or shelter work through apprenticeship type activities, internship activities. It's a way, again, of maintaining work culture so you don't get that bumpiness at the back end. It's just so much better to have a workforce group working to improve skills in a work setting than trying to transition people into work itself. So I hope that was responsive, Lisa. I think I heard almost most of what your question statement or whatever that thing was.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Okay.
I
And I'm not snarky, I thought it was good.
I don't see any questions. Let me just double check here. I see a new message.
No, we have a
Nope,
lot in the
good
chat.
insight. Yeah,
Yeah.
I really am just taken by the complexity of what you shared, but you delivered it with such clarity. So thank you for that. And I think you may have a mug coming your way that says, quote, heat-seeking money bag geezers. That was one of the comments. That was quite a mouthful.
Okay. I don't understand why people go to places that celebrates and rebrands a cockroach on steroids and calls it a palmetto bug. And it's also a place where, you know, the fire incidence rates in Florida are much higher in the north because it takes them so long to call on a fire. They say there's a fire down, and by that time the fire company can't come. So it's, you know, anyway, I don't understand those places.
Thank you, Dr. Hill. We are going to move now to Jung Kim, who will give us some insights from One Columbus. Thank you, Jung. It's nice to have you.
Yeah, thanks, Evelyn. Thanks, everyone. So what I'm going to present is some excerpts from our insights deck that we had been updating on a weekly basis. We're transitioning to monthly, but doing some updates continually in the background. So you're seeing pretty up-to-date data here. Sorry for the stretch. I think I provided a 4x3 deck and looks like it's converted to 16:9. But I'll just get started. Next slide. Next slide. So some macro data, you know, some of this will relate to what Drs. Hill and Hawley are talking about. Most of you, I'm sure, have seen this headline around the 20 million jobs lost across the country in April, following 870,000 in March. The BLS had the unemployment rate at 14.7%. Some state data came out more recently. I think they had Ohio at around 16.8%, so a little bit higher. But here in Columbus, well, we'll wait the metro data to come out soon, but I think we're probably closer to the national average, if not possibly lower. Next slide. So I dug into the employment report a little bit further just to see what was happening, and one of the data points in there that they had was, you know, the reason for the unemployment. So in the dark red, you have temporary layoff. That was the big driver of the unemployment growth. So in April, that was 18 million people. And the permanent layoffs, that increased from 1.3 million in January to 2 million in April. So yeah, there's definitely an increase there, obviously on our part in One Columbus. we're working hard to make sure that those temporary layoffs stay temporary, but only time will tell how much of those will convert to permanent eventually. Next slide. The report also had unemployment by race and ethnicity. Obviously, there are impacts across the board. One of the interesting things here is that the greatest increase seems to have happened with the Hispanic Latino population. They were at 4.3% unemployment in January, kind of around the national average, but that group's unemployment rate is now higher than others. So that indicates greater exposure to some of the frontline retail, restaurant occupations, and other jobs that the Hispanics, Latinos may be more concentrated in. Next slide. Here it's breaking down some of the key industries in the employment report, aligning it with our target industries. So we have 6 target industries. The first is automotive. And you see what's happened with automotive manufacturing, and then on the retail side with automobile dealers, how much of those jobs were lost in the US. Retail, apparel especially, as well as restaurant chains. Those are a big presence here, and what's happened with those industries. More so on their front lines, but who knows how this will translate to the headquarters, distribution, fulfillment type of base that is here. So those two, we were worried about them before with other trends like automation and mobility and e-commerce, Amazon, and I think as the previous speakers have noted, some of these forces have accelerated in light of the current situation, and we're working to see how this bounces back. Finance, insurance, not as much of an impact, close to neutral. Next slide. Logistics, e-commerce, there's been some winners and losers depending on the retail goods category. We all hear about Amazon, but other companies have done well in this regard. So it really depends on what type of goods they're selling. And unfortunately, we don't have that breakdown with the US employment report. Distribution has been kind of a mixed bag, again, depending on the goods. If it's health-related products, if it's essential goods, those operations have gone up, whereas apparel and other non-essential items, those have decreased. Healthcare, biomedical, similar kind of story. The categories don't line up that well with what we're trying to focus on. Obviously chemicals is a little bit too broad, but some impact there, but not as severe as retail and automotive. And then finally, our last target industry is around data centers and processes related to that. So if we're talking about hardware and then the actual data center operations, the data processing, hosting, a little impact there, and then a bit more in terms of computer systems design, which is the software programming development side of things. Next slide. This is looking at some data from the Federal Reserve, U.S. manufacturing capacity utilization. You see the dip that's happened in the last couple of months. In March, the percent of manufacturing capacity utilized, that was the lowest since the Great Recession 10 years ago. And then April, it's the lowest in the history of the data series going back to 1948. I only show the data from 2000 on, but even if you go back all the way, the percent of manufacturing kind of capacity that's being utilized is very low. It's probably lowest since the Great Depression, or maybe coming out of World War II as military production was wound down. Next slide. This is from a data source called Panjiva that we use to track ocean freight. So it gives us a bit more of a real-time data point with what's happening in the economy. And you see certain companies that have a key presence in our region highlighted here. So when you're talking about durable goods like a Whirlpool with their factory in Marion, or Honda, their imports are down. You see the supply chain impacts there from February, March, April. DHL supply chain, which has a significant presence here, they have about 50% exposure to automotive, so they're down as well, while their peer XPO is a bit more diversified, so they're about neutral. And then you see on the right of the chart, companies in the healthcare space, like Hikma Pharmaceuticals, Cardinal Health, their imports have gone up in response to demand. And then Vertiv, which serves data centers, the hardware side, their imports have gone up as well. Next slide. This is the monthly retail sales report from the Census Bureau, looking at March and April. So you started to see significant impacts in March, and then even more so for some categories in April. Up on top, you have food and beverage, the groceries, those sales going up significantly in March, and then also in April. And then towards the bottom, you have apparel, where the April sales were down nearly 90% year on year. So that's a huge deal for the key employers here in that space, L Brands, Abercrombie, and so forth. Next slide. So, this is a bit of an unusual downturn in some ways, because so much is really dependent on the consumers coming back. I guess in some ways it always is, but here you have the consumers leading the downturn, and to recover, whether it's automotive or apparel, we really need to see that coming back. Consumer sentiment has started to uptick a little bit, not close to previous levels. This is data from the University of Michigan's Consumer Sentiment Index, the Conference Board's Consumer Confidence Index. They reported out a couple of days ago and showed a similar trend. So we'll be paying attention to this, because it will matter a lot in terms of the sales coming back. Next slide. Okay, now we're going to dive into some more regional, local level data. Next slide, please. So we all know about unemployment claims. We've taken a few different approaches to visualizing the data. So rather than just showing huge numbers, what do they look like over time across the region? So here you have 12 bars, the Columbus region up on top, followed by the 11 counties in the region. And what we're doing here is adding up the latest continuing and initial claims and looking at that relative to the latest labor force data for each geography. So when we look at that, the Columbus region was at a ratio of around 11.1%, might be 11.8% in the week ending May 16th. So that was down for the third week in a row. It was at a peak of 12.8% a few weeks ago, and it's slowly coming down as the initial claims have gone down, as well as some of the continuing claims coming off the board. Another thing to note here is just how high the claims rate is for Logan County. They have significant exposure to the automotive industry, and in some ways it's different from Union County, which has more in the way of the R&D, the office-based jobs, engineers. With Logan, I think you're talking even more about the frontline production jobs that were impacted. We'll see what happens as more and more automotive production starts back up. But Logan is the highest in the state for this measure. Next slide. Here you have the Columbus region in red, and then some selected counties across the region, looking at it over time, week by week, going back to mid-March. So I talked about Logan County. You see some other counties like Union and Marion that are above the region averages, and then the two counties that were below. Delaware County is not that surprising, considering the the socioeconomics and the workforce. But I was a bit taken aback to see Knox County low as well. Next slide. We're using a tool called Burning Glass to do some analytics around job postings. This gets to the point that Ned talked about how so much of the data isn't up to real time, you know, especially from government sources. So we're using a lot of alternative data to track what's happening. Job postings in the region, they were already in some decline before the COVID crisis. And then you actually had this uptick in the latter half of March. And that was because of all the demand that was there for occupations like nurses, respiratory therapists, food delivery, distribution. But then it's come down further since as many employers have made longer term adjustments. Next slide. Okay, here we're looking at how job postings have shifted. So on the left, you have the employers who are posting more jobs, who posted more jobs in the latter half of March and April than the same period the year before. So the net difference. And then on the right, you have employers who posted fewer jobs. So the left, it's not too surprising. You have Amazon up there. You have a lot of the groceries or general merchandise type of goods, CVS Health, and then some logistics. On the right, DSW, L Brands, that fashion retail, that's on top. You also have some healthcare in there because a lot of them pulled back on the elective procedure related occupations, as well as kind of medical administrative support. So those were some of the greatest reductions. And then towards the bottom, Chase, I think they virtually pulled all their job postings back. And then Ohio State University, for obvious reasons as well, those postings went away. Next slide. So this is the same data for looking at May, the last 3 weeks or so. It's you have a similar mix, but you do have some retail coming back. Bob Evans, Rusty Bucket, they're amongst the top in terms of net additional postings compared to a year ago. And on the right, you know, Honda's in there now with the impacts, kind of that second wave impact on manufacturing. Chase, OSU are still towards the bottom, although not as severe compared to April, March. So, you know, both on the plus side and the minus side, the numbers are smaller. So getting towards some sort of equilibrium, but obviously not pre-COVID. Next slide. So this is a breakdown over time. So the 3 columns represent the second half of March, and then April, and then about a week into May, and what occupations have increased year on year in terms of job postings versus decreased on the bottom half. So on that first column, you really have those first wave impacts, registered nurses, respiratory therapists on the increased side, as well as some distribution type of occupations. And then on the minus side, if you can see things like nannies, babysitters, preschool teachers, a lot of retail, restaurant, frontline operations. A bit of a mix, but then as you go along the time frame, you see more and more of the kind of that later part of the first wave, second wave. So, you know, once food delivery got organized, restaurant delivery, those occupations started coming back. We were sort of surprised to see restaurant manager, but it really has been on the fast food and delivery side of things, at least in April. And in the decrease side in April, you start seeing office occupations, a broader mix of occupations starting to be affected. And then finally in May, you know, some of the top gainers were around cooks, kitchen staff, retail associates. So you do have some of those signs of reopening there. But then on the minus side, it really is getting into that second, third wave with larger mix of office occupations. Next slide. One of the data points that we've picked up on, a lot of companies are doing this with our device data, basically, tracking where people are going, how much are they traveling. So this is a data source called Cubic. They actually provide a lot of this data at the county level for free on their website. So, based on the access they have to device data, I think it's around 15 million, phones and other devices across the country. They're looking at how the median driving distance has changed. So the gray bar is sort of that peak lockdown in the second half of March, and then looking at it 2 weeks at a time. So April 13th in the blue bar, April 27th in the red bar, and then May 11th in the dark red bar. So in those weeks, how has driving changed? And you see, driving went way down at first, and then started to recover bit by bit since, and even before the reopening. So there was some activity happening there. Maybe it was work related, maybe it was leisure related. Doesn't go that far, but that's come back. Obviously, it's still below pre-COVID levels, but we're tracking this as a way of seeing what economic activity looks like. Next slide. So one of the things that's been highlighted in this data, and the previous slide showed Delaware County had the greatest reductions in driving, and it's revealed the gap in what's possible with remote work and who benefits from that, right? So all of us in this call can do this remotely, but if you're talking about the frontline production, distribution, retail, they can't. So the blue bars that are below zero in this chart are looking at pre-COVID. And normally, at least in our area, and I think most areas, the people in higher income block groups tend to drive a little bit more than those in lower income block groups. We're making enough money to justify the commute and so forth. But what happened mid-March is that suddenly the people in lower income block groups were driving a whole lot more than those in the higher income groups. That disparity has come down a little bit since April, but it still remains. So it raises a lot of questions around equality and our ability to keep ourselves safe and healthy, and how that varies depending on the socioeconomics. Next slide. This slide looks at some data from the Ohio Office of Budget and Management, just looking at what the tax fiscal impacts look like. The previous presentations talked about the importance of public sector, including at the local level. If the state data is one indicator, then it's probably just as troubling for our counties and municipalities, depending on these tax categories. So you start to see some impact in March. The CAT tax receipts got hit right away. Gross receipts is probably a more real-time indicator. And then what happened in April, sales and use tax down 20%. Personal income tax is way down, although that's actually mostly due to the tax deadline being postponed from April 15th to July. The April collection numbers are, usually the highest in the year, and the state currently doesn't have that benefit. So that will come back later on, but it does raise some issues around the fiscal year cycles and some of the financial inflexibility that may be there amongst our government agencies. Next slide. So I'm going to highlight something from our regional economic monitor. This we had coming out of our One Columbus strategic planning. We created a monitor that was trying to get as real time as possible. We had 18 indicators around our themes of growth, prosperity, and innovation. And when you have these criteria around real time, low lag in terms of the data being available, and then making it comparable across metros. We're looking at Columbus with all the other metros in 1 million, 3 million population range, totaling up to 35 metros. It didn't leave a lot of data points in place, but we had enough to pull this monitor together. So if you go to the next slide, one of the indicators that we have under the innovation theme is STEM talent. So this is using LinkedIn data and those profiles that are in engineering, IT, and research functions. And what we're doing there is comparing the year-on-year change in the number of those profiles by metro. The color coding that we use throughout the monitor, we have the 35 metros broken down into 5 quintiles. Ranks 1 through 7 are in green, 8 through 14 are in blue, and so forth, depending on how well they do on an indicator. So if you see Columbus there, we're number 3 amongst the 35. So in that green quintile in terms of year-on-year change. So despite everything going on, the STEM talent growth has remained pretty healthy. And this has been, despite the fact that our growth has been about level, it didn't accelerate. So if you go to the next slide, what's happened is that a number of these other metros in our 35 metro set have trended down. So I noticed a few categories where this has happened. So the first chart there, for metros that are more reliant on tourism and events, Orlando, New Orleans, Indianapolis, even with their conventions and amateur sports events, and Las Vegas, those metros have seen STEM talent growth decelerate faster than other metro areas. And you might think at first, tourism, STEM talent, what do they have to do with each other? But if you think about all the supporting functions with tech and other STEM going into, running events, hotels, and so forth, there's impact there. A lot of the startups that are in Las Vegas or New Orleans are oriented towards, their key industries. So you have hospitality startups, tourism startups, and so forth. So it's really impacted those metros. Looking preliminary at May data, Las Vegas actually turned negative. And these aren't jobs, these are profiles. It indicates that people are actually, on a net basis, moving out of the metro because of the situation. Nevada, according to the employment report, had a 28% unemployment rate. So by far the highest in the country. That is going to have an impact on population movement. And speaking of population movement, the chart on the upper right shows that metros that normally see higher domestic immigration out west, Salt Lake City, Portland, Denver, those have seen STEM talent growth decelerate as well. Next slide. Okay, next slide. I'll just end with what we've been doing at One Columbus. We're kind of transitioning back to, some sort of normal. But in March, April, we were intensely focused on our key existing businesses, reaching out to them, checking in on how they're doing, how we could help. We have hundreds of companies that have gone through incentivized projects, right? And they committed to creating a certain number of jobs and capital investment. And obviously the current situation has thrown a lot of that off track. So working out with those companies, how we treat those commitments going forward. Tracking a lot of intel on what's happening with our companies. In the full deck, we have a bit more of those examples. And, right now I'm trying to synthesize more of that because it does provide more of that real-time picture to what's going on in the economy when you're able to build up the intel from the company level one by one towards industries and then towards the overall economy. So I'll end there and see if there are any questions. Thank you for your time.